Okay, thank you for joining us here today. This is the third in the series of webinars, and today I'll be talking about some earth science and health with a focus on particulate matter research. I'm Dr. Bernhardt, Saini-Eidukat. I'm in the Department of Geosciences here at NDSU, and I will acknowledge all the people who have participated in this work. Let's see here. Okay, so many people have been working on this topic of particulate matter, especially folks at North Sanish College, Dr. Warren and Dr. Sens, Dr. Rahman Borhan, both in the Ag and Biosystems Engineering Department, students, Suman Datta and Daniela Lapoya, who worked on these, and of course people in the MPH program. Thank you very much for all your support. So, one of the things about air quality in North Dakota that motivates this research and the work that we've been doing is the oil boom, which started probably almost 10 years ago now, or 8 years or so. And there was a very rapid increase in volume of traffic on unpaved roads. And there were people who were out in the rural areas who were very concerned about the volume of dust that they were experiencing due to all of this heavy traffic. So the oil boom has moderated quite a bit. At its peak, there were well over 200 oil rigs active. Now we're just checked it the other day. We're down to 41. That's up from a lower number. But even so, there's still significant traffic that's associated with this kind of work because as the wells are completed, the pumping and much of the traffic is trucks that are taking the oil back and forth. So even if it's not active drilling, there's still a lot of traffic. So it's been estimated that a typical well will require over 2,000 truck trips in its lifetime. And so that generates a lot of what we refer to as fugitive dust. So here's a map, as you can see, of oil well sites. And each one of those dots represents one well site, and there are thousands and thousands in western North Dakota. So we're going to look at air quality, starting with a little bit of a more general look at what it is, and then we'll focus in on the particulate matter. There's a number of terms that are used for this. Fugitive dust is one that you'll find in the literature. Road dust. There's other terms that are used. So if you're doing a literature search, you actually have to be somewhat creative to find all of the published materials on that. So we're going to talk about how we measure and identify the particles. I'll introduce the instruments. There's a thing called the TAS, a tactical air sampler. It's tactical because it's portable and you can move it around. And this happens to be a particular brand name that we use, and there are other brand names that I'm sure are just as good. And then the identification, we use scanning electron microscopy. We'll talk a little bit about how that works. And I will be talking about a previous project that was done in southwestern North Dakota and current work and just an idea or two for some future work. So if we start on air pollution in general, what is it? Back in the 1970s, the Clean Air Act was passed, and it requires the EPA to set what's called a National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And they designated 6 air pollutants with the term of criteria air pollutants. And these are those 6. And there's the website where you can find those on the EPA website. Criteria air pollutants. As you can see, ozone, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, lead in the air, because there used to be leaded gasoline back in the day, and particulate matter. So today we're really only going to be talking about one of these types of criteria air pollution. So you can see that this is a big topic. We're only just touching one small part of it. And there are some other types of air pollutants that are not even included specifically in those criteria air pollutants, and those are some things that are of interest to us in North Dakota because of the release by oil well flaring. And as you're probably aware, there's been quite a lot of natural gas that is being flared off of these wells for a variety of reasons. Maybe there isn't the capacity for the pipeline, maybe there's a need to release pressure. Regardless, so here's a photograph of a gas flare at an oil site outside of Williston, North Dakota. And you're probably familiar with those famous satellite images of the night sky of North America and the big bright flare over western North Dakota. It's all this gas that's just being burned off. And among the compounds that are released are some volatile organic compounds, hydrogen sulfide, other types of nitrogen oxides that are, other than what was already listed, so, and of course CO2. So some of these are referred to as air toxics, and they are suspected to pose a health risk. And these are things that would need to be monitored, and I think it would be wise to move forward on that. But we're going to be focusing on particulate matter here today. And there's a lot to talk about, and unfortunately we can't talk about everything. So we'll have to save those for another day. So when we talk about dust, though, there's all kinds of definitions. You can come at it from a number of directions. These small particles that are, around us all the time, even out in space, right? So there's cosmic dust, which falls to the surface of the Earth as the Earth is moving through space. There's domestic dust, so these would be things that you find in your home when you're dusting your house, and you see them dancing in the sunlight beams. And then what we're going to be talking about mostly is atmospheric dust. And that can either be natural dust that's moved around from the Earth's surface, or anthropogenic, something that has been created by humans and then released into the atmosphere. So typically, anthropogenic ones are the ones that we're mostly worried about, although some of the natural ones can be hazardous too, depending on your location. So particulate matter then is a type of dust, you could say, or it's a term for any material, and it could be liquid or it could be solid or some complex mixture of material that is suspended in air. And so we call that particulate matter, or PM, is the abbreviation that you'll be seeing. And depending on their particle size and how far they may enter into the lung, you may have something that is inhalable, coarse particles, and we refer to those then as PM10. So that's that particulate matter with a subscript 10. And so these are inhalable particles that are between 2.5 and 10 microns in size. And there's another definition which I'll give you in a minute on what that actually means. And then there's the very fine particles that are less than 2.5 or less microns in effective diameter. And these are the ones then that can penetrate way down into your lungs, and the ones that I think are considered to be more hazardous. So the EPA has regulations on the amount of these that should be limited in a particular area over a particular time. Particles that are larger than 10 microns don't have a regulation there. I think there may have been one in the past, but there isn't one right now. That doesn't mean that they're benign. It's just that there's no current regulation on that. So this is this definition I wanted to give you about size. You know, these particles are not all perfectly spherical, right? So how do you measure a diameter? So really, what that is, what the size refers to is something called the aerodynamic diameter. So it's a hypothetical sphere that has a certain density. And so your particle then has an aerodynamic diameter that is the same as this hypothetical sphere. That's what the real definition is. So we're not going to worry about that too much, but just to make sure that we realize that not all particles are, you know, spherical. They may have elongated shapes or some other shape. So this well-known diagram from the EPA website, you may have seen this before, gives an idea then of the relative sizes. So if you think about fine beach sand, that might be about 90 microns or micrometers, right? So your human hair would be slightly smaller than that. So your PM10, you'd probably have about 5 of those in the diameter of a human hair, and your PM2.5, less than 2.5 microns, you'd have about 5 of those in one of these. Right? So these are very tiny particles. 2.5 microns are very, very small particle size. So more definitions then. Another way that you can define the sizes of particles or particulate matter is where they deposit in your respiratory tract. So we talked about the aerodynamic diameter. So your inhalable particulate fraction might enter your body through your nose, or you might breathe it in, and it might be trapped by your nose hairs or by the cilia in your upper respiratory tract. The smaller particles then, that might be less than about 30 micrometers or microns, could actually enter into the airways of the lungs. So those might be referred to as thoracic particulate fraction. And then the respirable ones, those are the ones, again, probably have the most health risk, are the ones that are less than 10 microns. So that's the PM10 or below. So, as mentioned, right, the smaller particles will travel deeper. And so what is the public health hazard? In addition to their penetration deep into the lung, there's other public health hazards. Just plain visibility on the roads. If you've ever been driving out on the road when there's quite a lot of dusty traffic, you realize that it can be hazardous driving. There's a question about whether or not the dust affects animals, livestock, and also crops, and if there are effects on water, soil quality. From the mobilization of this dust. And it really depends also on what the gravel road is actually made out of. Here's a cartoon from the Fargo Forum. wondering about the effect of all this oil traffic on livestock and other farming activities. Okay, so how are these particulate matter types generated? So we already mentioned that there's natural types of sources. Here's a picture of a volcano, an eruption in Iceland. It's called Eyjafjallajökull. This one erupted in 2010, and it actually stopped air traffic across Europe because the ash cloud drifted over into England and then further into Europe, and airplanes were not advised to fly through that ash cloud because the engines could essentially fail if the engines, the jet engines, encounter too much dust. So there are all sorts of natural types of dust sources. There are large dust storms that you might have seen pictures of out in western U.S., in Arizona, California, other places like that. There's other particulate matter like pollen that really affects people as a health issue. And then, of course, there's the anthropogenic ones. So any kind of particulates that are released from smokestacks, from factories. There are particles that are shed off the brakes of your cars every time you slow down. Other industrial activities, right? So let's focus in on work that we've been doing here in North Dakota for a while now. I'm going to focus on this part of North Dakota, Dunn County, study area down here, close to Dickinson. And North Dakota State University has a research extension center, both in Dickinson and one that's a little bit north of Dickinson near Manning, North Dakota. And that's where this work was carried out. Here's an example of the type of study locations that we had. So this is a gravel road that's out close to Manning, and these red circles are 3 areas where we had set up monitors. This is an oil pad. So this road here was actually created just for the oil development. There was no road before, and so we had an opportunity to sample here before the road existed, during its construction, and then after. So we got the full picture of how oil development actually affects particulate matter. And so there are no people living close to this area, but the effect would be the same, right? If there were houses next to this road or not. So we have these particular samples that have samplers, which I'll show you pictures of and how they work. We place them about 1.5 meters up off the ground. Here's an example of a typical sampling setup. So here's a road, east-west. And so we would set up samplers on the north side of the road and on the south side of the road. And we would set up one sampler with PM 2.5, and I'll show you how that works in a bit. Another sampler with PM 10, and likewise on the south side of the road. And the reason for that is that typically the wind is moving from the north or the northwest towards the south or southeast. So we wanted to make sure that we got samples on both sides of the road, right? Because we need to know if there's a certain amount of dust that we're picking up on the south side of the road, we need to know how much is already in the air before it crosses the road. That's one reason. Another reason is that sometimes the wind actually does shift, and it may come from the south and go to the north, right? So ideally, you'd have monitors, maybe even in a circular pattern, so you can collect dust downwind, no matter which way the wind is directed. Here's a photo of how these samplers were set up, about 1.5 meters up off the ground, so we have poles. These are the samplers, and these little stacks here I'll talk about in a second. They determine whether or not you're sampling PM 2.5 or PM 10. Here's the other sampling setup on this access road to drill pad. Here's the drill pad, oil well drilling here, so we had samplers on both sides of the drill pad, and again on the north and south side of the road. Here's a photo of a truck coming down this road and releasing quite a lot of particulate matter as it was coming by. Closer up photo of what these instruments look like. Essentially, it's a vacuum cleaner. And there's a filter in here then that's trapping the particles. But it's a very special vacuum cleaner because it's calibrated to measure the volume of air that is coming through it very, very precisely. And it has to be very precise because you're measuring the weight of these dust particles per cubic meter of air. And so if you don't know how much air is moving through it, if you don't have a good measuring device, you won't be able to make that calculation. So here the road is being built right now, and so again, we were sampling during that time period. So here's that stack. This filter mechanism that's on top of the device, you can set it up in 3 different ways, really. They refer to that as an impactor. So what happens is, as air is drawn in to the system, there are flanges that divert the air, and particles that have a particular aerodynamic diameter will either get caught in a little pot of grease, or if they have a lighter aerodynamic diameter, they'll pass through and then get caught in the filter. So with the PM10, there's one of these impactors here. With the PM2.5, you have 2 of these assemblies. So you're taking out the larger particles and then the smaller particles, and only the smallest particles will make it through and get caught on the filter. You can also essentially not have one of these impactor assemblies on the device, and in that case, you're measuring total suspended particulate matter, the TSP. That's good for looking at sort of the whole variety of material that is flying through the air. But as I mentioned before, EPA does not have a quality standard for total suspended particulate matter. So you can report it, but you won't be able to say anything about air quality based on the measurement. So here's what the filter cassettes look like. So the filters, there are different kinds of filters that you can use. The ones that we were using are, they're referred to as quartz fiber circle filters. I should mention that they're not actually quartz mineral because they're not crystalline. They're really more like fiberglass. They're like woven fiberglass. You'll see some SEM pictures of them later. You could also use a polycarbonate filter. What's really important is that you have to condition the filter at a particular temperature and relative humidity before it is weighed, before you take the sample. And so you need a climate-controlled room that temperature and humidity is controlled. And you need a very high-quality microbalance that can reliably measure to 1 microgram. And those are not easy to come by. The standard lab balance just is not good enough for this type of work. So once you've conditioned the filter and weighed it, then you can keep it in these little plastic or what other kind of container, and you transport it out to the sampling site, carry out the measurement, then return the sample as quickly as possible, recondition the filter, meaning you have it in this room at the same temperature and relative humidity as before, and weigh it again. And you probably weigh it 2 or 3 times until the weight has become stable. And then you can calculate the difference pre and post. And then you know how much. I'll show you the calculations here real quick. I won't go through all the details, but you then calculate the micrograms per meter cubed of air. What are some of the other pieces of information you need when you're doing this? You need to know what the temperature, relative humidity, and barometric pressure are at the sampling site. So you can either get that from the Weather Service, or if you have one of these portable measuring devices, these little weather stations. Typically, there's a company called Hobo that is a common place to get this kind of instrumentation. You can measure wind speed, wind direction, temperature, relative humidity, all of that, all at the same time, and because that's important. The barometric pressure will affect the volume of air that's moving through your stack. And the temperature will too. And so again, you need to have a very precise measurement of your volume of air in order for this to work. If you're close to a road and you're worried about traffic creating fugitive dust, then it's useful to have a traffic monitor, and a simple trail camera works remarkably well for that if it's set up properly so it doesn't catch the sun. And it even works at night with infrared, and so you can do pretty good traffic counts and correlate your amount of dust with the amount of traffic if that's something that you're interested in. So just measuring the weight of your filter and then calculating the micrograms per cubic meter, that's one measurement. Another measurement you can do is you can actually look at the particles in the scanning electron microscope and try to figure out what the particles are. Are they mineral particles? Are they biological particles? Are they anthropogenic particles? So here's a filter that's been used, and so we take a razor blade, we cut a small piece out, and we put them on a holder and have a look at them in the electron microscope. So here's what one of the pieces of filter looks like under electron microscope. Here's a scale bar, 25 microns. This bar here is 25 microns. So you can see that this is essentially like fiberglass. And all these fibers here catch the particles. So these little dots here are particles then that we analyzed. And we analyzed hundreds of these, right, to try to get a statistical understanding of what the particles are made out of. So you can make spot chemical analyses by putting the electron beam on a particular place. And then you can, this EDS means energy dispersive spectroscopy, you can get a chemical analysis then of the spot. In this case, you see there's a peak here. This is silicon, Si, and this is oxygen, SiO2. You can get weight percent from that analysis. You can then calculate the ratio of moles of oxygen to silicon based on the atomic mass. And from that, you can see that there's 2 atoms of oxygen to 1 atom of silicon. So SiO2, probably that particle there is a piece of quartz. Okay, so if this is the 25 micron scale bar, that size that particle is like, you know, a couple of microns, right? This makes sense. We're talking about PM 2.5. So the problem here with this method is that when we talked about filters, these filters are actually made out of SiO2. So it's very, very difficult to get a clean chemical analysis of a particle because everything is laying on top of these fibers that are made out of this SiO2. So using polycarbonate filters would be a good idea for trying to measure the chemical composition of some particles that don't have a lot of carbon in them. So probably the best idea is to use two different kinds of filters. These filters work very well for weight measurement because they don't absorb a lot of water. Polycarbonate filters do absorb some water, but those are probably better for measuring the analysis of particles. So here's another example of a more complicated particle. There's the particle right in there. Again, here's your scale bar, 25 microns. These are all the fibers. Here's another particle right here. Right, that's a pretty big particle, actually. It's like about 10 microns size. And there's a lot more information in this one. Whole variety of elements: sodium, magnesium, aluminum, silicon, potassium, calcium, iron. Of course, you're going to have a lot of silicon just coming from the fibers themselves. But what you can do is you can try to normalize the number of moles of these to get a chemical formula, and by looking at the morphology of the particle and its chemistry, you can fairly confidently say, well, this is a particle of clay, a clay particle. It's not always so straightforward. Well, what about biological particles? They have a very particular chemical signature. You might have a little bit of phosphorus, potassium, or some chlorine in it. You have very relatively large amounts of carbon and oxygen. You're not going to have any silicon or anything like that. So you may have some other elements in it. So there's a way to kind of identify, both from the morphology and from the chemistry, if you're looking at a biological particle, like pollen grain or something like that, versus a mineral grain or an anthropogenic grain. So, example then of what you can do after measuring hundreds of particles is you can come up with some statistics. And so here's an example of a particular location. It's not that important exactly where it is, but you can say, well, most of the particles here are going to be some kind of silicate, and quartz mineral is also a silicate. So really you're talking about well over three-quarters of the material then is some kind of silicate. 12% biological, some carbonates, and that's really about as good as you can get using this method in terms of identification. It's very difficult to identify the exact mineral. On the other hand, there's another location. This was out in the field before the road construction. You see that almost 70% of the samples here were the biological. So this was basically out in a field before the road came in. So you can see that there are actual statistical differences in what you're looking at. And again, this was the TSP, so we were not filtering out smaller particles. We're essentially analyzing everything that came in to the sampler. Okay, so another example of that kind of work. Okay, but what about the actual concentration calculation? Well, I mentioned before that you need to know the airflow rate, and you need to know that at the condition that you're measuring it at, which is the ambient condition. So that's why you need to know what the temperature is at the time and place of your measurement. And then you can then calculate the actual flow rate, and that's in liters per minute, based on the actual ambient pressure and the actual ambient temperature, and there are some instrument-specific measurements that you take into account. It's basically a calibration kind of a thing. So you get your actual flow rate, and you multiply that then by the time that you're running the measurement for. And so the EPA standard is like a 24-hour measuring period. Now, if you're not actually measuring for 24 hours, you could measure for 20 hours. You just have to adjust for that so that it's all standardized to 24-hour equivalent. So once you have that, you have the net mass of the filter. That's after the weighing, right? Difference from the post-measurement weight from the pre-measurement weight. You have the volume of air that went through at your ambient condition, and so then you will get the actual particulate matter concentration. And then again, the units are in micrograms per cubic meter of air. So there's an example of some correlations with some measured factors at one of these sites. This is a complicated diagram, so I'll kind of walk you through this. This is from Suman Datta, master's student, who's working with Dr. Rahman out in this area. So along this axis here, we have the average particulate matter concentration in micrograms per cubic meter. So 0, 50, 100, 150, 250. And that applies to the PM10 and PM2.5. So this orange and red bars here. And it also applies, although it's not listed here, it also applies to the number of vehicles that were passing by the measurement station. Along here are different sampling dates. Okay, so here, we've over 150 vehicle passages. Right? So that's that. On this side, though, we have rain in millimeters, and this scale starts from up here and goes down. Right? So the increasing numbers are here. So in this case, on this day, it looked like there was almost 3 millimeters of rain. Okay, so a rain event here and a rain event here. And of course, that's going to be important, right, when you're talking about dust. If the roads are wet after a rain, they're not going to be quite as dusty. Okay, so there's your micrograms per meter cubed. So what do these mean? What do these numbers mean? Are they good? Are they bad? Well, the EPA has put out national air quality standards. So for PM2.5, those are 35 micrograms per cubic meter. PM10, they're 150. Okay, so you can see right in here, 150 is like right up here. So remember, these blue bars are the number of vehicles. That's not what we're interested in. But here, on this day, although there's a very large error bar here, right? For the PM10, we're almost at around 150, but again, there's a big error bar. So in most cases, it's not an issue. It wasn't an issue at this sampling site. 35 runs right through here, so we're sort of at or around that level of concern for a couple of the sampling dates. So there are other things to correlate with, though, right? Here we only have rainfall, right, and vehicle traffic, but what about wind speed and direction? So I'm not going to get into all that, but Suman actually statistically ran a regression on all the factors to try to figure out which of all of the factors were the most important. And if you're interested in that, you can read his thesis. So why are these standards again? If you go to the EPA website, it's Criteria Air Pollutants website. They've got primary standard, which are for sensitive populations, secondary standards that are just sort of general public welfare. So if we're talking about PM, so they have them listed for all 6 of those criteria pollutants, but we're only talking about PM here. So for PM 2.5, we got your 1 year average number, okay, which we did not measure over a year. There are some places that do that. But if you're talking about the 24, it's 35 micrograms per meter cubed. And again, for the PM10, it's the 150 micrograms per meter cubed. So that's where I got those numbers that I mentioned down in here. And then you could draw a little line across here and see how many times you exceeded the level. So here, for example, it says not to be exceeded more than once per year on average over 3 years, that kind of thing. Okay, so that is the PM air quality standards. There's another EPA quality standard that is called the Air Quality Index, AQI. What's neat about this is if you go to the website, you can actually look up real-time air quality for many places around the country. Unfortunately, I tried to go to, put in Newtown, North Dakota, and there was no data. So something to fix on that. We've got to get a monitor up there. So this number goes from 0 to 500, right? As you can see, and they also have it color coded. So how does this work? Well, this can be calculated from all 6 of the criteria standards. But what if we don't have all 6? What if we only have particulate matter? You can actually go in, and they have a calculator on their website where you can calculate particulate matter, and you can choose, right, your PM 2.5 or your PM 10, or you can choose some other things, and then you can enter the concentration that you might have, and it will calculate the air quality index, this AQI, that is here. So I threw in 35 in here, hit calculate, and so that gives you an air quality index of 99, which is moderate, and it'll say how it affects different groups, right? So sensitive groups might be at risk, and cautionary statements and so forth. So this is really handy as a tool. And then you can also go the other way. You can calculate from the air quality index to the concentration. So I'd recommend going to this website. It's called airnow.gov, and there's real-time data on there for different places. So faculty and students at NHSC have been doing this research and have been very, very successful. They've been presenting locally and nationally on this. Here's a few photos that Flo sent. This is one that I took, and Flo sent some of these other ones, and this is their experimental setup as they're getting ready to go out and measure. And so that's been going on for a couple of years, and hopefully it will continue to go on. I think that might be Flo right here. And so one of the ideas that we've been talking about for the future is using personal monitors as opposed to setting up these tactical air samplers, which still are portable, but you do have to set them up, and there's a lot of kind of work involved, right, with the weighing of the air filters. There are a variety of off-the-shelf now personal monitors, and there are some that have been around for a while and that are kind of medium expensive, but now there's a whole kind of movement towards do-it-yourself makers, and so you can buy the parts and put these together, or you can 3D print these cases, or you can buy them. Somebody else has put them together for you. And so here's a neat website that we've been looking at here. Is that right? Taking space? I thought it was topping space. Well, I guess we fixed that. But anyway, the instrument here is called an air beam, and they have this system that's called air casting. And the reason that it's called air casting is that it actually broadcasts information. If you want to, you can broadcast it and share your information, kind of like in a social way, and actually have it displayed on the map. So there's an Android app that's associated with it. So as you, is it taking? Oh, okay, all right, good. So this is correct, taking space. There's an Android app that's associated with this. So here, for example, the monitor then is showing in real time as you're moving around, particulate matter. In this case, they also have a CO, carbon monoxide meter, and they have some other humidity and other things that are attached to this. So you can map and graph your air quality data in real time on your smartphone, or you can send it to other folks. And I think that's kind of a neat concept. And this happens to be sound, so they have decibels, but the idea is that you can be moving around a space, making measurements as you go, and seeing what's better and what's worse, and color coded, and so forth. So this is potentially a direction that some folks might want to go in, or they might want to investigate it. And other potential future work, especially in terms of this fugitive dust, or the work, or the dust that is released from roads. Different roads actually have different kinds of characteristics. And so there has been research on this, and there's something that's called emission potential. So a particular road surface might be not very emissive, right? And so there are ways to mitigate road dust. And there's been research that NDSU has been doing on this, and other people, on how do you actually coat a road, or can you put some certain kinds of chemicals or something else on the road so that it doesn't release quite as much dust. So there's research that can be done in this direction. There's research that can be done on what type of gravel is actually put on these roads. There has been some question in the past. Are there some harmful materials in the gravel? You could use satellites. And I know that there are some folks that are doing that in other parts of the country. In the past, it's been difficult, but now the resolution of the satellite imagery is getting better and better, and the access to high-quality satellite data is easier than it used to be. So this could be a way that you can look at a larger area and maybe changes over time. And it's something that I think we should look into. There are models that are out there already that will predict dust movement based on wind direction and so forth. But there's, that's something that I don't know has been applied in our particular area. And we already talked about abatement methods. And then there's other environmental factors that are sort of human-type factors. We're talking about particulate matter. What about exposure to something like tobacco smoke or some other kind of smoke, cooking smoke, or other firewood smoke, or whatever that you might have in your environment? So those are sort of human health issues that we might want to look into. So, see if we can get a little, I don't know if this little movie here is going to work, but here we are out in the field. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you do have questions, I guess now would be a good time. Yes.
So some of the literature that I've come across with air pollution and public health aspect, they only study PM 2.5 or PM 10. They don't study them together. What are the advantages or disadvantages of just looking at one of those sides for a particular matter?
I think if somebody's only measuring one, they're probably just trying to save time. Because there are standards for both. But if you're going to study only one, 2.5 would be the one you want to look at, because that's the one that actually penetrates the material. So it's probably considered more of a health hazard. Okay, well, thank you very much. And if you have questions, you can contact me at